It's probably appropriate that I'm speaking after lunch, although most people don't like this slot, in that our medicine that we sell is Travelan, which is indicated for prevention of traveller's diarrhea. So for those that go to Bali or places like that and they go, oh, should have I eaten that salad, or should have I had the ice in that drink? You know, if you have Travelan, that's the solution to your problem. So other than the other biotechs today, we're talking about products that treat diseases. Ours is a little bit different in that we're trying to develop a product that prevents the disease. And we have a collaboration with the US Department of Defense. We've worked with the Army and the Navy in the US and in Asia. And the Centers for Disease Control in the US, they say that 30 to 70% of people that travel to high-risk regions get traveller's diarrhea. And that's true whether you go to Bali or to India, and our American customers go to Mexico or the Caribbean. But it's also true, obviously, of the US Army and the US Navy that travel to these same high-risk regions. It's a big problem. They call it warfighter readiness, and that's why most of our R&D that I'll talk about today, all the way from laboratory through preclinical work that we've done in rodents and in non-human primates, i.e. monkeys, and now into human studies, has been funded with US Department of Defense funding. So it doesn't have a big cash burn on what we do. Our technology in some respects is already proven, and most of our shareholders tend to be people that have taken Travelan, it's worked for them, and they've invested in the company. And so we have a wide open register, about 227 million shares. 2,500 of those shareholders are based in Australia. So we're listed in Australia on the ASX. 35% of them are based in the US. We're also listed on NASDAQ. Definitely fit the criteria that we talked about today. So relatively low market cap for what we have, and a cash balance at the end of December of $15 million. And not sure why that is. And if you have a look at the slide deck today, I'll talk to you about why that shouldn't be the case. So we have a proven product on the market. So Travelan has been studied in a phase 2 trial. So you've heard today from people talking about phase 2 is where they show safety and they also show efficacy. In that phase 2 trial, which is conducted in Poland, it showed up to 90.9% effectiveness in preventing traveller's diarrhea. And that's why the US Department of Defense was so interested in it. So we know this product works. We're going through the process of getting Travelan registered as a drug in the US. It has to go through that FDA process. Even though we already know it works, we need to repeat these studies. So we just completed a phase 2 study, again, to show that it works. And that clinical study report will be out in around July of this year. And upon doing that, we'll have a meeting with the FDA. It's called an end of phase 2 meeting, and we'll talk about protocols for a phase 3 trial, which is the registration studies that are necessary for registering the product. You may ask, why do we want to register the product as a drug in the US market? And that's a good question, because we are already selling it, and we're selling it in the US. So unlike Australia, where we can claim prevention of traveller's diarrhea as well as relief, we can't do that in the US. It's sold as a bovine colostrum dietary supplement without label claims. And we do know from speaking to people that roughly 50% of people, when they travel to these high-risk regions, you'll go there to a travel clinic or your physician to get a vaccine for, it could be for cholera, could be for hepatitis A, B, could be for, depending on where you're going, yellow fever or whatever. Ideally, you want people also to get Travelan to prevent traveller's diarrhea. That's generally not the case at the moment because the product's not approved by the FDA and doctors do not write prescriptions. So automatically we're precluded from roughly half of the US market. The other benefit of getting a drug approved in the US is that you can have your product reimbursed. So unlike Australia where we have Medicare, in the US it's private health insurance, and the private payers pay for drugs that get prescribed by doctors. So good reason to get registration of our product. You'll see down the bottom there on the sales slide. So maybe I might click back and forth. This slide's very important. It explains a number of the reasons why the share price has been depressed. So during COVID, you can see that our sales went down to almost zero, which is not surprising for a travel medicine. People were not traveling. And I could put a picture of a plane going up, and that's the trajectory of the sales since. So we're putting a lot more sales and marketing effort behind it, but that wouldn't work if people weren't traveling, and they are. So if you have a look at the statistics for both Australia and the US, travel's picked up internationally significantly. In fact, for Australian travellers, Bali's overtaken New Zealand as the #1 travel destination, which is good for us because that's one of the target markets for our particular product. So sales went up last financial year by more than 100%, and in the 9 months of this year, we're up 154%. So sales are going strongly. Most of those sales are in Australia, and so that's where the big opportunity lies. We also have the product on the market in US and in Canada, and we've just started marketing efforts. So in July last year, we launched on Amazon.com in the US, and just last month we launched in Walmart as well, and just relaunched into the Canadian market. So much bigger populations than the Australian market. And if we can repeat the success that we've had in Australia, in the US and Canadian markets, the sales potential is huge. But we don't just have a product on the market, we're also a biotech company, and we're using a platform technology to develop new medicines, not just Travelan, but for other targeted pathogens going through that same process. And I'll just go back a slide to explain what is our technology. So we have a single technology platform. I think Leslie was talking about having 4. We have 1, but what we do is that we take a vaccine that's been developed. So Leslie spoke about COVID, COVID vaccines targeting the COVID pathogen. Each drug that we develop is targeting a pathogen. So in the case of Travelan, that is enterotoxigenic E. coli, 13 different strains of it. And what we do with the vaccine is we don't vaccinate humans. So our product is an oral tablet that you take with meals. We vaccinate a pregnant cow. And you say, why would you want to give a cow a vaccine to produce a human medicine? And there's a good reason for that, and it's all to do with the anatomy of a cow. So you're probably familiar with what colostrum is. So that's that first milk that the mother provides to the child, if you like. And it's the same in the case of cows. But the big difference is the placental wall in a cow is too thick for immunity to pass through it like it does in other mammals. And so a calf is born essentially without immunity, and all the immunity it gets is through colostrum. So when we give a vaccine to a cow, it produces polyclonal antibodies. And right at the beginning, it talked about targeted polyclonal antibodies. They are specific to whatever the vaccine was for. So for Travelan, it's E. coli. And for some of the other programs, there's Campylobacter, and we have one also for Clostridioides difficile. It targets that. Changing the slide order from yesterday, and I think this is important. So bottom left is showing here what causes enteric disease or traveller's diarrhea for another word, different types of pathogens. So we talked about enterotoxigenic E. coli, which is the Travelan target. The good thing is that we know through research that we've done with the US Army and Navy that it doesn't just target E. coli. It targets a number of these other Campylobacter, Salmonella, etc. In fact, in actual samples taken from Army and Navy personnel in Asian studies, they showed up to 180 different target pathogens with cross-reactivity to Travelan. So it's broad spectrum. And I think John asked me the question, so why is the Department of Defence so interested in our product? And I said, because it's the #1 cause of warfighters not being able to fight, getting disease. And you can go back through all of the wars, whether it was Desert Storm or any of those wars, all the way back to Vietnam and other places. Traveller's diarrhea or enteric diarrhea is a big reason that they have not been effective in the field. And we know that. I don't know how many people have been to Bali, but 30 to 70% of people that go there get diarrhea. And it may clear itself up in 2 days, but you have a horrible holiday. There are no FDA-approved drugs for prevention of traveller's diarrhea. We could be the first. And these are our partners. So I've mentioned a few of them, the Navy, so that's the Naval Medical Research Command. In collaboration with them, we've just completed a phase 2 study. We had top-line data readout on the 7th of March, and if you have a look at the share price graphs, you'll see a positive reaction to that. The full data comes out in July. We have another phase 2 study, Campylobacter ETEC, similar product, but different vaccine for a different targeted pathogen, so Campylobacter in this case. That phase 2 study has completed dosing, and we're just waiting for the data. That data is also coming out in July. We also have a phase 4 program. So a phase 4 program is essentially a phase 3 study that's done on a marketed drug. So this drug is Travelan, the over-the-counter medicine. That's why it's called phase 4, marketed product. It's being done by the Uniformed Services University at their cost, and they're running the trial independently. A little bit different than the phase 2 trials, which were done in healthy volunteers. So in infectious disease studies in phase 2, people volunteer to be infected with the targeted pathogen. So in the case of the Travelan study, people went into the clinic and they got given a bolus of E. coli, knowing that that would cause them to get sick, especially if they're on placebo. And the idea is to show that it prevents it. So, but in a phase 3 or phase 4 trial, you're relying on people naturally getting exposed to different pathogens when they travel to high-risk regions. So in this Uniformed Services University study, this is actual US and UK military personnel travelling to high-risk regions. Because they may or may not get traveller's diarrhoea, the numbers need to be a lot bigger in order to get powering for statistical significance. So in that trial, it's 866 military personnel travelling to high-risk regions, and we're about 64% of the way through recruitment on that study. Really looking forward to the data on that as well. That's due out in December of this calendar year. And on the back of that data alone, I'm hopeful that we may be able to get into the CDC Yellow Book as a recommendation for prevention of traveller's diarrhoea, even before the FDA approval. I really like this slide. Every time I come up and do an investor presentation, what I like to do is show the different milestones and the timeline for achievement of them. And whenever we complete them, we colour them in blue. So everything in blue here we've done. You know, we said we were going to do this and we have done it. So I like to walk the talk, so to speak. And you can see in black, these are the upcoming milestones, so rich milestones coming up. These are the things that we're going to do, and some are happening in June, July, August, and some are happening at the end of this calendar year. So near-term events for all of our clinical programs. This slide's important. I joined the company less than 2 years ago, and because of that slide that I showed earlier where during COVID, not only were we not selling Travelan because people weren't travelling, but also very difficult to do clinical trials for travel medicine. And so there was a hiatus of about 2 years where the clinical trial program was put on hold. And one thing we do know is that when you stop doing something, you need to come back and check, does the market opportunity still exist? So I hired an expensive US market evaluation firm called Lydeamore to come in and have a look at the market potential, not only for Travelan, but also for that other therapeutic I mentioned, IMM529 for Clostridium difficile. And I wanted them to look at standard of care as well as other pipeline products that people had. And the good news is they came back and said, because of the nature of our product, it's oral, it has a different mechanism of action, it's non-antibiotic, it doesn't have any problems of antimicrobial resistance, there is an opportunity, and the opportunity is relatively large. So in each case, in the US market alone, we're talking US $100 million in revenue potential for our product. So not addressable market, that's a sales forecast, if you like, for each product. So what to next for Travelan? We reported phase 2 results back in March of this year. Next steps, as I mentioned, is to get that clinical study report, have the FDA meeting, and look at phase 3 trials, which is the registration studies to get regulatory approval as a medicine in the US market. We have had some preliminary discussions with the FDA, so I can tell you what I think they'll be telling us at that meeting, and that there'll need to be 2 phase 3 studies, roughly 600 patients each study approximately taking 2 years, and each study approximately costing about $5 million. So that's the path forward for Travelan. Just closing on this last slide here, this is IMM529 for Clostridium difficile. This is a hospital superbug, which is a real problem. They get treated, it's about a $1.7 billion market, and that's mostly people spending money on antibiotics. People get treated with the antibiotics, they get cured for a while, and 20 to 40% of the time it comes back and it comes back. It's one of those recurring problems, a big antimicrobial resistance issue. We have the world's first triple mechanism of action, a product developed in conjunction with Monash University in Melbourne. And we're preparing a pre-IND filing at the moment with a view to starting a phase 2 trial on that next calendar year. So a big milestone coming up. Quite excited about this one. I might just close there, John, and open up for any questions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for taking us through Immuron today. So we've got some questions. Just duck over this side with the microphone.
Yeah, while John's coming up with those, I think people are talking about publications, but for those that are scientifically minded, all of the work that we have done has been published largely, and that's preclinical and clinical studies, and that's the references are in the slide deck. And you can click on them and have a look. Everything from monkey studies and studies in Asia on cross-reactivity to different pathogens and the like.
Hello again. I can understand why you're so happy that we're travelling to diarrhoea potential places, but as a very consistent and avid traveller, and I do travel a lot, I have never seen your product advertised anywhere. How are you marketing it, and why aren't we seeing it being marketed?
That is a very good question, and
Obviously.
it's one of the reasons why the sales potential for this product hasn't lived up to expectations. So it'd be fair to say that before I came, the company was run by people who are focused on science. If you go back through the company's history, we've done studies with Travelan in NASH, so in fatty liver disease. We've done studies in colitis. We've done studies in urinary tract infection. The good thing out of all of that is that the product has potential in all sorts of things. The problem with that is that we haven't focused on generating revenue from the asset that we do have. So it'd be fair to say in the past we have done a pretty poor job of sales and marketing of the product that is on the market. That changed about 18 months ago when I joined. I've hired a guy called Flavio Palumbo. He's ex-GlaxoSmithKline and Procter & Gamble that is experienced in consumer healthcare marketing. And we're just starting that process. And that's why you're seeing those sales shoot up the chart. We've established that in Australia. He's just hired a new marketing person that's going to take over Australia. Now he's going to focus his efforts on the US and Canada. So in the last 6 months or so, I think on targeted advertising, we've hit about 6.5 million people in Australia, which is we're targeting people that are doing searches for mostly through online. There are sales reps which call on pharmacies. So a pharmacist or a pharmacy assistant is educated on how to recommend the product to people if they come into pharmacy and ask that question. But if they don't, you need them to think about, there are no other products for prevention, so we need to make them aware that it exists in the first place. We're doing that through online mostly, through paid search, through Facebook, YouTube, all those different channels.
Steve, next question on you right over here. Thank you, Ken.
On one of your slides, you had 3 days treatment, first 3 days and 14 days before departure. Is it a cure or is it a treatment to stop? And how often do you have to take it if you're in a country reasonable long term?
Yeah, the study that I mentioned before, we showed up to 90% effectiveness, was a 3 times a day dosing. So typically you would start taking it a couple of days before you go, just for your body to get used to the product, and then you would take it with each meal. That was that particular study. The most recent one we did, we tried once a day. It wasn't quite as effective, but we got some ideas about how to change that. The Uniformed Services University study is actually twice a day dosing. So we're still searching out the right formulation and the right dosing regimen for the phase 3 trial. But we do know 3 times a day works up to 90% effective, but it's with each meal essentially. Yeah, you need to be taking it with each meal for each day that you're away on the trip. So we sell a box of 30, which is roughly, if you take 1 3 times a day, it's roughly a 10-day trip.
Steve, just building on the first question about sort of marketability and getting further out there, you're dealing with the US government, which we know to potentially help their soldiers. I mean, there are many other armies within the Western world. I mean, how can you actually expand into, I guess, these other countries, and what approvals do you need from their local regulatory authorities?
In a sense, we already are working with some other so in the Uniformed Services University study, there is one recruitment site for UK military personnel that are participating in that study. Once we get the tick of approval from whether it's the Army or the Navy, other military personnel tend to follow. That's an interesting market in and of itself, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that work in the military. Really, it's more about a validation of it working and their interest, because our target market ultimately is people travelling on vacation to places like Bali or Mexico or what have you, a much bigger population number, much bigger market.
Final quick question today, Steve. We have been talking about valuation propositions and all of these. So should investors today look at you as a biotech or industrial? You're generating revenue, which is an industrial, or it should be a biotech, but the science is there. How do you see peers?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer, but we're essentially two companies in one. We're an emerging consumer health company with a product on the market. Our revenue for 9 months to this year is around $3.5 million. We really need to get to about 10 million plus in order to be a profitable consumer health company. And we're not that yet, but we're on that path, as you can see from the graph there. In terms of a biotech company, we have 3 therapeutics in 4 clinical trials, which is quite rich for a company as small as we are. And as I mentioned before, up to today, most of that R&D has come from US Department of Defence funding and not from capital raises from shareholders. We have $15 million in the bank, and so we're not looking for capital as we speak. But as these trials progress, and if we can't get grant funding for phase 3 and we don't partner before then we might be looking at that.
Steve, thank you very much for taking us through Immuron today.
Thank you very much.